Right. Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Gross from the marketing team. Thank you for joining today's webinar about the changes coming to client authentication using public certificates. This session is being recorded and we'll share that with you after we wrap up. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A section and our presenters will answer them at the end of the presentation. Your hosts for today's webinar are Tim Callan, Chief Compliance Officer at Sectigo, and Jason Sirocco, Senior Fellow at Sectigo. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hey, Jason, how you doing today?
Hey, real good, Tim.
All right, so we're talking today about private CA and in particular about an important event in the industry that's causing us to discuss this today, which is some changes in MTLS and client cert and how that can be used for public certificates. So we'll walk over that. We'll talk about what private CAs mean and give you a strategy for how to get there. And Jason, you're the subject matter expert today. I'm the color commentary, so take it away, please.
Tim, this is about ringing a bell, but I think needs to be rung just as importantly as you've been talking a lot about 200-day, 100-day, 47-day certificates. This is another issue that I think people need to be looking at. And what is changing, Tim, is that I think you covered very well in the Root Causes podcast at the end of last year, major distrust event, and I think that this is essentially another fallout from it.
Yeah.
And part of the issue is that basically Google within their root store program, the Chrome root store program, version 1.6, which was published in February of this year, basically started to talk about how there is a major issue with the lack of certificate agility overall.
Yeah.
And the probably the most major issue with certificate agility overall has to do with things related to client authentication certificates. Now, our industry, Tim, as you know, has gone through many years of taking away other usages from publicly trusted certificates, everything from signing to
Right.
you name it. And this is just the final shoe to drop, essentially.
Yeah, right. Like once upon a time, if you go all the way back in time to like the 90s or early 2000s, people would, once you had a root and it was in systems, that was such a rare and precious thing that you just kind of wanted to use it everywhere. But we're at a point now where, we can update current hierarchies into the clients that we need them in almost all cases. And so this excuse of kind of like, look, I've actually managed to get my root out there, so now I'm going to use it for every use case I can think of, doesn't really work anymore. And you're right. So for a long time, this has been being pared down, and this is the last one. This certificate agility thing you talked about, last year, what was the driver behind this last year was there were these major revocation events, and they were delayed. And by the way, there's some of that still going on in 2025, but the big year for that was last year. They were delayed, and the excuse that came up over and over and over again, I'm talking about like dozens of instances, was, oh, well, we can't swap these certs out because these people aren't flexible. They won't be able to get them replaced in time. And if they don't, then the following horrible thing is going to happen. And the response that came back to that is, well, then clearly the certificates are being used in the wrong way. Right. And that kind of high level response to the excuse, clearly these certificates are being used in the wrong way, is certainly an element of what is driving this change now.
Yeah, Tim. So I think this slide is doing a good job of explaining what exactly is happening. And then I think we need to talk a lot more about the why it's happening, because I think it's
Yeah.
important. But as you can see here, as part of that Chrome root store program change from February of this year, one of the things that just ticked by, Tim, June of this year, June 15, was the fact that the creation of new roots that are publicly trusted that also allowed client authentication that already stopped. There will be
Yeah.
no more routes that are created that will be trusted by the Chrome Root Store program. But I think what's most important is that you now have um, probably just a little over 10 months to do inventory of your publicly trusted certificate issuance and have a really good hard look at, are you using client authentication certificates? Because the essentially every route that's out there, every publicly trusted route that's out there that is actually issuing these client authentication certificates, these certificates and these routes will no longer be trusted by Chrome.
Yeah.
And so, Tim, you've said it best. Even one of the smaller root store programs, if they make a determination like that, the CAs have to respond. For Chrome, we're all responding, and we'll
Yeah.
have details on that as well.
And a good thing to clarify here that we've talked about, you and I have talked about in other webinars and things in the past, is there's a difference between what a browser would call a software or product-based change and what they call a requirements or program-based change. So product-based change might be, I'll say, look, our browsers are not going to honor any cert that does the following thing, which would mean we could still issue those certs and you could use them as long as you were confident that they weren't going to touch a Chrome browser. However, there's also program-based changes, which this one is, where they said CAs are not allowed to do this, regardless of whether or not that cert is touching our software. And this is a program-based change, which means to remain in the good graces of their program, this is a change that must happen. And that means that this is a hard deadline. This is not flexible. And this is something that we are going to honor. And every other CA, if they know it's good for them, is going to honor it as well.
Thanks for that, Tim. That's very important. And to those of you who don't live and breathe publicly trusted certificates, really what Tim is telling you is this is a major important change that the CAs cannot ignore.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's one of these changes that isn't just inside baseball, like good old MPIC, right? It's an inside
Yeah.
baseball change. That's very interesting. You and I talk about it. Guys like Nick France talk about it. But
But the subscriber doesn't need to do anything different in the case of MPIC. In the
and
case
in
of
this case,
this, yes, you sure do.
and
Yeah.
that's why we are ringing the bell, because time is very quickly ticking by. As part of your PQC inventory taking, just as an
Yeah.
example, where are you using RSA, where you're using ECC, you right now absolutely have to be asking the question, where am I using client authentication certificates? Tim, just before we leave the slide, I want to make this really viscerally easy to understand. Publicly trusted certificates, if you think about the use case of why we use them, why people subscribe to them, it is to be able to prove ownership of a domain. It is to be able to have that miracle of encrypted communication between a web server and a web browser. And these client authentication certificates are meant for a different use case,
Yeah.
authentication. And for so long, Tim, it was difficult to get certificates of any kind from anything other than a public CA. And therefore, that's why people got them from a public CA. But that is an inappropriate usage now because of
Yeah.
the problem of certificate agility. We'll talk about that further.
So June 15 is the hard deadline from Chrome, but there are some dates leading up between now and then that are important.
Yeah, Tim. Just about every CA has reported on this. Sectigo's information is that as of April of this past year, the year that we're in right now, we've actually removed client auth from
From our EIDA certs, right? Right.
exactly, and then we're going to further take that away from all of our publicly trusted certificates in
Mhm.
September, middle of September this year.
Yeah, and to be clear, starting in September, what happens is this is where we move into what we call the screen test phase. So we're going to turn it off, and we fully expect that there will be places where someone has a problem with this. And by the way, we've seen that we've seen with other major changes, and I'm thinking about the deprecation of our last legacy root, or the expiration of our last legacy root was, I was going to say, it's in 2021. I don't know if you remember, Jason. I think that sounds about right.
Yes.
We talked, we messaged very aggressively to our subscribers to say, hey, this root is going to stop working on this date. There's nothing to be done about it. The root's expiring. It should be fine. If you're using modern chaining, nothing will even notice. It should only affect extreme legacy certs. Tell us if you have any issues. And we almost universally got the response of, nah, it won't affect us. We're fine. We're fine. And then the day the root expiration happened, all kinds of people were running around with their hair on fire because they didn't realize that they weren't fine. And so for a major change like this, we go in with the philosophy that people who think they're fine are going to learn the hard way that they're not fine. Now, if we waited until June 15 and said, that's it, they're all shut off, too bad, so sad, then if you have a problem because you have a system that won't work, you're just down. You just have an outage, right? There's nothing to be done. If we do something early, like on September 15, then when it turns out that your certs don't work, what you do is you call your rep. You say, hey, my certs don't work. And then we can actually flip a toggle on an account by account basis that will allow you to continue issuing certs while you fix your problem technically. And then when you've done that, we're going to flip it off again. And that's very important because let's say there's a second problem that you didn't realize because the first one masked it. Well, when we turn it off again, now you'll find that second problem. You'll call us back and say, hey, it's still not working. We'll turn the switch back on. You'll fix that problem. And we'll do that as many times as we need to. And by starting at September 15, it's not a crisis. If we
Right.
did this on June 15, or heck, for that matter, March 15, it very well could be. So this is our process. We use this for every major change like this. It works very well, and we will be doing it here as well.
So folks, I'm here to ring the bell and
Yeah,
say, folks, this is 5 weeks away that
yeah,
that this process starts. So if you're smart, you're starting immediately to
yeah.
start to have inventory to understand what you're going to have to be communicating to your CAs about, including Sectigo.
Yeah, and we've been messaging this a lot to our customer base. So I'm hoping that for most of the people on this webinar, this isn't the first time you're hearing about it. But one of the things we found is that no matter how much we communicate, things get lost, things get forgotten about. Somebody says, I'll put it off until tomorrow. And somewhere along the line, someone has a problem.
It's not
So
like you
this
don't
is
have
us
anything else to
telling you
do.
yet again. Yeah, so this is us telling you yet again. And then note this May 15 date. May 15 is our hard cutoff. At that point, there's full removal. We shut the software off. And that's also a policy we have for a major change like this. And this is to deal with unforeseen circumstances. Let's suppose that there's some kind of error, software error when we shut it off and we need to roll it back and do it again, right? So we need a little bit of time to ensure this kind of thing has happened because once again, starting June 15, if I issue a cert with a client EKU, I just have to revoke it. And you can't use that cert. And so all of these dates give us time to make the changes we need to make as a public CA. So think of September 15, this is going to change. That's where you have some help from us to get your things fixed. But May 15, that's the hard deadline. We're done.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay. So Jason, why is this happening?
Yeah, I'll tell you something. Multi-purpose certificates. This is something that we were talking about at the top of this webinar, which is our industry, publicly trusted certificates have mostly weaned themselves away from multi-purpose certificates. And I'm talking about certificates that are used for purposes other than TLS server certificates, the standard web server to web browser encryption that we know and love. And so using publicly trusted certificates for client authentication, I would say that it probably was never a great idea. However, it did occur. These types of certs were allowed, and this is the final m- different purpose other than just client, other than just server certificates that which is the core of publicly trusted certificates. It's
Yeah.
the final piece of the multi-purpose cert world that finally needs to be expunged from our systems. I would say that a lot of you might not have even thought about it. The reason why we have these types of certs, there was demand for them because of the fact that it was just such an easy way to procure certificates for authentication rather than using a private certificate authority, that people use them. The problem, of course, is that these types of certificates are hard to swap. And so
Yeah.
one of Tim's favorite subjects on planet Earth is delayed revocation, and you can't live in a world where delayed revocation is intolerable and at the
Yeah.
same time have certificates that cannot be easily swapped. It's just that
Right.
we can't live in that same world.
Right. And so when someone comes to you and says, you can't revoke this cert because it runs a nuclear power plant and there will be and you turn around and you say, well, that cert shouldn't be revoked running the nuclear power plant. That's the
That
problem.
cert that shirt that certificate should not even be logging into Salesforce for you,
Yeah.
salesforce.com, right?
Yeah.
It
Exactly.
shouldn't be used for anything other than sitting at a web server, sitting in a load balancer, and doing TLS server certificate type of
Right.
use
Right.
case operations. So, imagine if we still had certificates, Tim, that were doing code signing at this point in time. It would just
Mhm.
seem insane, but we did have certificates like that at one
We
point
sure
in
did.
time.
We sure did. Absolutely.
And
All right.
yeah.
So go ahead. What's the
No,
client
no, Tim,
authentic?
this is
Yeah.
good. Go ahead.
Yeah. Please.
So this thing that's being removed, the client authentication EKU. So for those of you who know your certs really well and know how they're crafted, the X509 standard includes this special EKU. This basically, this is the beautiful thing about PKI and the policies that are written onto a cert. One of the most important policies there is of course the expiry date.
Right.
One of the other policies that's on there is, hey, what are the things that are allowed?
What am I allowed to do with this?
What am
Yeah.
I allowed to do? And it's imprinted right into the signed certificate itself from a public CA. It's actually part of inherently what a certificate is. The policy stamped right on it. But you might now, by this point, be listening to Tim and I going, my God, these guys are just such inside baseball talkers. How does this relate to me? And this is where we start to pivot in the webinar now to, I think, where most of you guys listening to this live. Anytime you have anything where you're referring to mutual TLS or MTLS, anything where you have certificates being used for API to API communication, IoT devices, are you using publicly trusted certificates to perform VPN authentication? Are you using publicly trusted certificates for putting them onto mobile devices for the purposes of Wi-Fi access point authentication? You might be putting those certs there through technologies such as Intune, JAMF, or other MDMs. So, Tim, this is not even an exhaustive list, and this list is extensive. Like, I don't know a company in the world that has electricity that doesn't do one or all of these.
Right.
And you might be using publicly trusted client authentication certificates for one of these use cases or all of them. And you need to be hyper aware of where you are using them because those certificates are going to go away.
So
And
Jason,
just as
that's
it
a
says, yeah, go ahead,
perfect
Tim.
transition to how do I know if I'm impacted?
Yeah. So, Tim, I think that what's important to note is if you're using publicly trusted certificates to secure websites, in other words, certificates that are going to load balancers, certificates that are, whatever.com, whatever that certificate's registered to. If it's a domain and that certificate is actually used within a web server, a load balancer for the purposes of basically anything that has to do with that web server to web browser encryption. That standard public use case that's been around for a little over 30 years now. That's not what we are referring to. We are referring to the one other use case that's still allowed in publicly trusted certificates, which is anywhere where publicly trusted certificates are used for client authentication. And that previous slide shows you the different use cases that may be occurring. But this really means that you need to be auditing your existing certificate inventory
Yeah.
today. Please contact your CAs. Please talk to Sectigo. We'd love to hear from you. You don't have to wait till September 15 when we start turning off the lights for those certificates. Start talking to us now.
Yeah. All right. So what do I do instead? Right. And for a lot of
Yeah,
this stuff, I think this is a good use case for a private CA.
it really, really is, Tim. So if publicly trusted client authentication certificates are essentially going away, and we just have to assume that we have to procure them from somewhere else. You're not going to get them from the same kind of public issuance system that you've known and loved for 30 years and plus a couple months. Um, Basically, public certificate authorities are really meant for browser trust, not for internal authentication. Everything you see on the left-hand side, we've now talked about it in several slides. But I want to introduce the idea of where is the appropriate place to get those kinds of certificates, client authentication certificates. And that is a private certificate authority. And I
Mhm.
know what some of you are thinking. Those of you who have a little bit of gray hair like me as well, you're thinking, I remember PKI from way back. I remember what it was like to set up a private CA. That was difficult. It was priced out of, there's no way I would spend the money on a private CA for the types of use cases. Wi-Fi access point authentication, that's not $1 million implementation. Right. And that's why modern private certificate authorities we've thought about this. We've thought about this really hard. Extremely purpose built enterprise identity and control through private certificate authorities. The certificates that you have full control over. You no longer have to worry about 47-day. You no longer have to worry about these certificates not having tight integrations with identity. In other words, the certificate, instead of just being registered against a domain, it can actually be registered against your DevOps workloads. Wow. The ability now in a modern private CA to have powerful automation, everything around zero trust segmentation, and Tim, so importantly, uh, a roadmap towards cryptographic agility.
Yeah.
So public certificate authorities were never meant to do this. They shouldn't be doing this. They won't be doing this. But now you can do this with the full flexibility of a private CA.
Yeah. And the reason I think that some people have used public search for this in the past is the idea of running your own private CA is daunting. You've talked a lot on the Root Causes podcast, Jason, about the dangers of getting your PKI wrong. And I think that's where a managed private CA, a managed PKI solution can really help with that. All right. So what happens if you wait?
Well, Tim,
Yeah.
here's the thing. If you wait, unfortunately, you're going to end up finding out
Mhm.
probably as early as, starting from 5 weeks from now. It could be as early as it happens if you're using Sectigo certificates, that you're going to start to have some downtime, some disruptions.
Yeah.
Um, People who are starting to audit your systems will start to red flag, hey, you're using certificates that are probably going away or have gone away, depending on what
Right.
time frame we're looking at. And, I think Tim gave you the best example, which is, roots themselves, public roots even themselves have a lifespan. And we as a CA know what happens when roots go away and people don't act on the implications of that. This is really not much different than an entire root going away. The issue is probably the bigger issue at all is the fact that your use cases of authenticating to a VPN, authenticating to Wi-Fi access points, authenticating into, API to API, machine to machine type communication, if you're using publicly trusted certificates for those purposes, you're going to start to see broken services, login failures. People are going to start to call your help desk,
Yeah.
and you cannot afford to have this blind spot in your certificate inventory.
All right. So I already kind of alluded to this a little bit, but what does a modern private CA look like as opposed to maybe the bad experience that some of us might have had in the past?
Tim, it's the same reason why a lot of people chose to use Microsoft CA, right?
Yeah.
Microsoft Active Directory Certificate Services, because it was built right into the operating system. The problem is it lacked visibility. It only worked in a very, very specific stack of technologies.
Mhm.
And if you actually implemented full-blown PKI for these purposes, just remember this. You were actually implementing a PKI that was probably meant for something as complex as nation state citizen ID, literally, literally. Nation state citizen ID capable PKIs for the purposes of just client authentication. And so therefore there's an enormous advantage in having an extremely purpose built private CA. And not just purpose built for simplification purposes, but
Mhm.
ironically, even more capable when it comes to modern IT needs. So think about your current Microsoft CA, just an example. You probably, I'm using just probability terms here, Tim. The chance that you actually configured it correctly, actually
Right.
backed up the private keys and generated the private keys within an HSM. The ability for you to have um, it, technologies that are addressed that are beyond just Windows, and therefore be able to take advantage of other operating systems, the cloud versus on-prem, and everything else that we do in modern IT. Most private CAs that were built 20 years ago and that people are still using and starting to implement today were never meant at all for this modern world we're living in. And so therefore, legacy PKI
Oh,
is something that
oh,
I think that we really need to see as being exactly that, legacy. Those PKIs are great and they'll be running for years and years and years. But I think that for these new use cases that are lightweight, extremely focus driven, the ability to set them up with a private CA that's packaged right, be able to be implemented very, very rapidly. The promise of a modern private CA is something that actually delivers on that. Just that I think
yeah.
a lot of you guys might be unaware. And so, Tim, I think maybe one of the final points here, and I'll take advantage as we're bringing that slide back up,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Sorry about that. I don't know why it went away, but I think it's up and running again.
yeah, no
So
problem.
keep going. All
So,
right.
so yeah, so I think the final point here is
Oh,
this move by Google is a bold move. I think you'd agree with that, Tim.
yeah.
But, but it was a long time coming. I think it was
Mhm.
inevitable. But I think that the final point I wanted to make on this particular slide is this. Google probably, and I'm just guessing here, Google probably would not have made the move it did in changing its root store program to take away client authentication certificates unless modern private certificate authorities were available to the market. And this is what I'm saying. This ain't your grandpa's PKI anymore. We do now have properly packaged and properly delivered private CAs exactly for replacing these, you know, replacing the inappropriate usage of public trust certificates for authentication.
Absolutely right. I want to confirm you're seeing the slide deck and you're seeing just the full screen view, right? Or are you seeing the
I
two
am
window view?
I'm seeing the two window view.
Ah, all right. I'm going to stop sharing and fix this. I apologize. Keep talking, Jason. I don't know what happened, folks. I'm sure that was user error on my side, but I'll get this fixed. Give
No
me
problem,
just one
Tim. I'm
second.
gonna start to talk about what's on your next slide, which is so what do you do?
Right.
And I think, Tim, in really simple terms, what's important to note is if you haven't heard about post-quantum cryptography and what it
Okay.
that's perfect, Tim.
Now we're
Thank
right.
you.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
next slide, Tim. Next slide.
Okay, go.
Yeah, so look, there's not a single guidance body in the world that hasn't given you the advice of you must be taking inventory of your cryptographic assets. You
Yeah.
just must. And this is now just one
For
more
multiple
reason.
reasons. Yeah. There's three reasons I can think of, but go on.
Yeah. So this is like we're talking about, do you know, like the homework for everybody right now, do you know if you use client authentication certificates? Raise your hands in the room is what I would do if Tim and I were on stage right now. If you can't answer that question,
Yeah.
you have homework to
And
do.
and furthermore, how many do you use? Where do you use them? And what are they down to the individual cert? And if you can't answer that, then you can't say yes to that question.
That's step one,
Right.
and that's step two.
Yeah.
And so you literally have, right? What is it? The 5 weeks before things might start to break on you, and you'll find out the hard way. But as it says in the slide, within the 60 days, look, guys, you probably should be calling, Sectigo to look at the private CA capabilities so that once you have actually done step one and step two,
Mhm.
and you know now that these certificates need to be replaced with a private CA source, then you should be evaluating that trusted private CA option to replace those certificates, Tim.
Yeah. Yep.
And the rest of this, step 4 and 5, are probably things that your IT teams will need to be doing. For those of you who are technical, it basically means that you might have things that are just hard coded to talk only to a private CA, to a public CA, and that will need to change. But there's no way you can even begin to start to do step 4 and 5 without knowing what certs you have. You can't manage what you don't know you have, Tim, and that's what step
Yep.
1 and 2 are for.
Absolutely.
So, a modern private CA, when you are evaluating them, right? Everybody's going to need to do a procurement of a private CA,
Mhm.
and this is really just your checklist of what should that private CA be able to do, and it absolutely should be able to be driven by an API for automation. I mean, how can you live in a world today where you're not automating such complex things? Um, when we say works anywhere, we're talking about um, works in a trust hierarchy that can extend trust into hybrid systems, be cloud native, be able to talk to operating systems that are not just Windows, but also iOS, Android, and anything else that you happen to be using, including Linux, especially, and the back ends of your systems. But, the rest of these, this is not about reading off an entire list. This is about even though we have a simplified and very, very purpose built private CA that we're referring to, we're not giving up things such as flexibility of a root. If you have to have systems where you hold the root close to your chest in an offline system and you want to use a Sectigo private CA just for an issuing CA, guess what? We can do that. Um, and I would say that if you look at all previous private CAs and hardcore PKI systems, they're notorious for having almost no visibility outside of their own little silo. And
Right.
Sectigo's modern private CA, Tim, has probably the most important pillar, the thing that sits on top of all the pillars of certificate lifecycle management, which is full visibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Speaking of
yeah,
which, yeah.
yeah. Speaking of which, go ahead, Tim.
No, 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 please, Jay.
All right. So this is about, the very final bullet point on the last slide is really this is double clicking on this, which is this is such a fast win. And that might be surprising to a lot of you. Imagine saying that you can have a private certificate authority that is fast, fast, fast to implement and
Yeah.
works with what you have, doesn't take months to implement. We're talking about hours. Look, I'm gonna,
Yeah.
if I had a colleague, Tim, I'm just gonna make this one last point. My sales engineer colleagues really, they're incredible in the sense that what's the actual work now in a private CA to stand it up? It is literally to try to figure out your specific needs and to configure the certificate profile. And then everything else is literally a button click away to set this up. Really, the only work in setting up a modern private CA is to make sure that your certificate profile is chosen appropriately. And that is all. The rest of it is the magic that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah. I was just thinking, I remember that you and I did a root causes episode. This was a long time ago. This was probably like episode 150 or something, where we walked through a case study of a same day private CA
Yeah.
configuration where it was up and running at the end of the day where the project started. So that is the thing that happens. Doesn't have to be the same day, but if you're in a hurry, it can be.
By the way, Tim, look, I'm just going to say it. Sectigo's origin story, if you go back to 2017, a lot of us came from other parts of the industry, other forms of PKI. Some of us are like 30-year veterans plus. And the one thing we all came together and agreed upon was that we wanted to have turnkey cloud native private certificate authorities. And here's the funny thing, Tim. I just,
Mhm.
as an aside amongst friends, as this fireside chat here on this webinar,
You
um,
and me and all of our other friends. Yes. Go on.
Sectigo achieved it literally months before the COVID epidemic. And that's why you didn't hear about it too much because the world was kind of busy with other things. But we're here now to remind you of what was released back then. So this is not a new thing that we just released yesterday. This is something that's been around, had its tires kicked, and is one of the most rock solid products that you can imagine. And trust me, you're going to need it once you find out where you are currently using client authentication
Right.
certificates.
And you're going to need it when you find out what's coming. So what's coming?
Wow, Tim. So if 200 100-day, 47-day certificates wasn't enough, and this lack of tolerance for delayed revocation, which has now led to things such as client authentication certificates going away, you now have another shoe that's dropping, which is the post-quantum era. You might as well say we're in it now, even though it's a funny thing to say, post something when it hasn't happened yet. The reality is that it is post having to think about it. And so once again, if you're taking your cryptographic inventory properly, um, you know, raise of hands, do you know where you are using RSA certificates versus ECC? If you don't know that, again, you need to be utilizing things such as certificate lifecycle management to help you with that. And so, Tim, I think what's interesting here is we start to have to ask the question, if you're going to stand up a private CA right now, if it has to happen right now, would you choose a system that is brittle in the sense that it could not extend itself towards a post-quantum capability?
Right.
I think for those of you
Yeah.
who are smart and reading the tea leaves, you're realizing that you're gonna need to be future-proofed so that you can on-ramp the current right now private certificate authority to become post-quantum capable, Tim.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is where, you have an advantage having Sectigo as your CA and your private CA partner because we have been following PQC from the very beginning. And we have been right on the current edge of what's going on with it every step of the way, including the fact that we have our post-quantum cryptography sandbox, where you can actually go get MLDSA compatible certs today and run them in development environments and watch everything break so you can figure out what you need to fix. And that is an example of what you get when you're with the forward-looking advanced partner like Sectigo.
If you are using Sectigo's private CA, it, you really should keep in your mind that the Lego building blocks of moving towards PQC capable private CA are there. That is something that is important to note. And
Yeah.
therefore, you know, for those of you who need to get your hands dirty and even start to deal with harvest and decrypt problems, something you may have heard
Mhm.
about, you can start to get your hands dirty with that immediately. But for those of you who, though, are listening to this webinar and you think that just dealing with, oh my God, client authentication certificates are going away, I need a private CA, we can help you with that. But this slide here is just a reminder that, at Sectigo are dedicated to making sure that you will be able to be on ramped towards being PQC capable.
Yep. All right. So how to migrate without disruption?
Yeah, Tim, I think that the phase migration plan really starts with that inventory taking. Take that slide we showed you previously, the
Yeah.
step 1 and 2, take it
Yeah.
really, really seriously. But you cannot think of it outside of the context of certificate lifecycle management and automated issuance. Think about this, Tim. That May 15th date where Sectigo is
Mhm.
completely no exceptions getting rid of client authentication certificates,
Yeah.
um, that is actually going to be, what is it, 1 or 2 months after we move down to 200 days certificates.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And
Mhm.
so this is happening in real time together. The
Yeah.
shortening of certificate lifespans, the disappearance of client authentication certificates. You
And the
know,
need to migrate to post-quantum cryptography. They're all happening all at once.
it's all happening all at once. So this migration plan becomes a multi-tiered thing. And I don't know how you survive in that future world without automated issuance and certificate lifecycle management from day one. Nobody should be thinking about any of this outside of zero trust and their DevOps and their compliance strategies and making sure that you're up. All your systems are running with all these changes that are in place. So, guys, the second part of the slide is I hope that I can't ring the bell enough on this. Tim humors me on some of these things, but I think Tim is fully on board with ringing the bell as hard as
Yeah.
anybody. And you can't delay this, guys.
Yeah.
Discover all your certs. You can't manage certificates you don't know you have. And and therefore, avoid manual certificate replacements. Make sure that you know, this final bullet point here, get cross team to buy in early. What this is really saying is you've got multiple teams who probably have such hard day jobs. They, they even if they pass themselves in the lunchroom, they might not even talk about, hey, this client authentication certificates, do you use them? I think that everybody needs to get to a single table and buy into the idea that everything on the left-hand side, this
Yeah.
migration plan, certificate lifecycle management, doing zero trust right through your organization, that's the buy-in that you need in your organization. I know your day jobs are hard, but this is an important part of making sure that you do have that uptime and you're doing things right.
And Jason, let me put a line under something you said earlier, even though it's not sitting in the slide, I think is important, which is you have major existential level initiatives going on right now. It is shortening certificate lifespans for public TLS. It is removal of MTLS. It is migration to PQC. All of these things are hugely overlapping. And if the Venn diagram is in complete overlap, there's a giant field in the middle that's all three of those. And I think you're very, very, very motivated to think about all three of these initiatives together, take a coordinated approach that is dealing with all of them, and look for those synergies and those opportunities to do work once that serves all three. And discovery is a perfect example. Don't go do 3 discovery exercises, do 1,
Yes, I
right?
really think that step 1 and 2, Tim,
Yeah,
are critical to do all of those topics at once.
yeah,
Why wouldn't you? It's just prudent, it's efficient, and it really is, killing multiple birds at once.
yeah. All right. So this sort of makes the business case for acting now. So walk us through this, Jason.
Tim, I think that a lot of you who are not the technicians, you don't sit at the Linux command line, you don't sit in the identity or the security department. Maybe you're the CISO, maybe you're the CIO, maybe you're a CFO. I think what you're even without understanding all the words, without understanding all the technical mumbo jumbo and the acronyms that Tim and I use here, I think what you guys who are not at that cohort probably really do understand risk. And if you are the owner of risk in an organization, you realize that time is of the essence because the changes that are happening rather rapidly. And that's why we're ringing the bell as soon as we are. I think that acting now is going to save you a lot later because you never want to be in a situation where you're even thinking about downtime or failing audits or firefighting. Those are just unacceptable. Like Tim used the word existential. Yes, that is what this is. Your stuff will go down. Full stop.
Mhm.
And so you don't need to be Linux command line person to understand the implication of that. You can be the CFO and fully understand that. And so therefore, this is not the fear, uncertainty, and doubt slide. This is we're calling out the reality that there are changes happening rapidly.
Yeah.
And if you don't address all three of the things Tim just said, but this webinar is specifically about client authentication certificates, you will literally have systems that will be unable to authenticate at some point in time in the future. Don't be that company that realizes it too late so that it becomes a firefighting experience, which is just the worst thing ever.
Agreed. So, we may have covered this.
Yeah, we did. Step 1 and 2, guys, if you're not doing it right now, you have to be doing it this afternoon.
Yeah.
I'm not joking. You have to be discovering and identifying this thing that we're talking about. TLS client authentication certificates. Your homework right now is, do you know if you're using them? Chances are you might be. And therefore, where are you using them? And then you must be starting step 3 and 4 and 5 after that. But I think step 3 is one of the most interesting. And that's what this webinar was really about, which
Mhm.
is there are private CA options that are available to you today, not the least of which is from Sectigo,
Right.
that will help you to move past this challenge. And then trust me, once that private CA is up and running, it's going to be one of your assets that you will appreciate and that will be extending trust into all your systems.
Yeah. So this is just a little bit about Sectigo's offering by way of example. We're not the only private CA in the world. Whether you go with Sectigo or go with somebody else, definitely consider the category because it solves so many problems.
Precisely right, Tim.
Yeah.
It ain't your grandpa's PKI. That we're talking about extremely modern, purpose-built private CAs to solve this exact problem.
Yep. And by way of example, one part of what you get when you get a private CA is it ties into an entire giant ecosystem of integrations and things that you can use. And we don't have time to go into all of this, but all the real common use cases are covered. It also ties into CLM. So if you want to use Certigo Certificate Manager as a CLM or another CLM, tie your private CA into that as well, right? So that you can handle them all in one place together.
That's right, Tim. If you can't manage what you don't know you have, this is the place to manage what now you know you have.
Yeah. All right. So we do have an asset. If this is something you want to get more information on, go download. That's quite a URL, but we have a business case for internal PKI guide that you can go get. If you go to Sectigo and search on internal PKI, you can find it.
And this will be sent out to everyone that registered. We'll send you a link to download.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And then lastly, Jason and I referenced a couple times in the fact that we do the Root Causes podcast. We have more than 500 episodes published. We've been doing it for 6 years. New episodes every week, and we talk about all kinds of things in the world of digital certificates, PKI, encryption, and whatnot. All the topics, every topic we've touched on today is something that we've covered multiple times in depth on the Root Causes podcast. So we strongly recommend that you come join us there if you want to stay current on what's going on in the industry. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, great stuff. We got a lot of questions, so hopefully we can
Okay.
get to all of these. So the first one, you guys have talked about, you need to start with doing the discovery, understanding where all your certificates are. So we had a couple questions come in on how do I even do that? Like, do I have to go through client auth and examine code on every single system? Do I use packet capture? You know, if I'm a Sectigo customer versus not a Sectigo customer, like how is it different? Maybe you could give us some clarity on that.
Yeah, I can tell you that a good certificate lifecycle management system will do discovery, and that is a place to start. I think that if you are want to expand beyond publicly trusted certificates, then that's when you start to need to bring a lot of other teams to the table. Because you might be using other private certificate authorities in places that you never expected. Tim, one of my
Yeah,
favorite ones that I love using, I still stump CISOs to this day. You know, you've done it on stage as well. Homework. How many of you in this room, how many of you listening to this webinar have a Kubernetes cluster somewhere in your organization, or maybe a
uh,
hundred of them? Every hand goes up. How many of you know that there's a private certificate authority sitting inside of that that you probably don't have visibility to?
right,
And then that's when the faces change
right,
and people realize, wow, I barely have an understanding of where all my PKI is in my
right.
organization.
What is the certificate policy for that Kubernetes cluster?
Yeah, it's probably
Crickets.
crickets. It's
Right.
probably it was
Yeah.
probably an open SSL, set of Linux commands that fired up a private CA with God knows what certificate profile,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
that is scary, and it should scare you, and you need visibility to it. But for the purposes of this webinar, I think the answer to the question is because they are publicly trusted certificates, then certificate lifecycle management discovery is going to be your best friend here.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure.
All right. All right, so we have a few questions on kind of use cases. I'll try to consolidate them to make this a little easier. The one that's the most common question I had a few times was, what about certificates that are used for our enterprise clients, like externally? So for purposes of authenticating to enterprise APIs or external clients, are there best practices around that? Kind of the perception is that private CA certs are meant to be used for internal only. Can you use them externally?
Yeah, no, that's not going to work, right? The private CA has to be talking to systems that you control, right? So under those circumstances, you will need an external facing cert, but it's not going to be your standard TLS server cert that you're using as a server cert, right?
So yeah, so Tim, I like I like to use the terminology. It's a like a consortia type PKI where trust is
Mhm.
extended across third parties. Private certificate authorities are used for that every day. In fact, there are entire industries who've standardized themselves around consortia-based private PKI. And yes, we can talk to you about that. So if you are using business to partner or a literal consortia of trust, and you are currently using publicly trusted certificates for that, if they are client authentication certificates, you will need to change. And so, therefore, if you're extending trust to third parties, private certificate authorities can be made and have been made and are used the world over right now to be able to extend trust across third parties. And that's an important thing to note. This term of internal PKI is really it's a misnomer. It's not Private PKI does not have to be purely internal. It is quite often used internally. It is most often used internally, but for that specific question, please note that I don't want to get into it. It's one of my favorite subjects about where private CAs are used for external purposes. But yes, if you're using client authentication certificates for those purposes, you're going to have to do something.
All right, thanks, Jason. So we had a few questions come in around this September 25th deadline.
Du-du-du.
So the first one is, September 25th, is this September 25th, midnight, right when we hit September 25th? Is it end of the day, September 25th? Going into the 26th. Oh, sorry, not September 25th, September 15th. Um, and then around that also, just we talked about that's the day we'll preliminary, shut stuff off, and then if there's problems, we can turn it on, toggle. Like, is that date flexible? So you can get ahead of it if you know it's going to be a problem. Can you push that date? And then kind of final around September 25th is what if we have a cert that was issued before September 25th that's going to September 15th, I'm sorry, that's going to renew after that time. How do I plan for something that's renewing after that's been issued before?
Yeah, so any cert that's been issued before will be fine for its full lifespan, obviously. That's not going to go back and retroactively blow those up. When you do need to renew those, or if you need to replace though, we're not going to be able to replace it with that EKU. So that is point number one to be aware of. The September 15 date, we are going to switch everybody over on that date. Now, if you as an individual enterprise find that that's a problem, then you can contact your representative here at Sectigo, your sales rep or your customer service rep, and we can temporarily turn that back on for you. Again, the vision there is we turn it on until you get it rectified, and then we turn it back off and confirm that it's working correctly. What we don't want to do is just flip it. It's about it until May 15 rolls around and suddenly we have a crisis, right? So that's the way we want to work that. I'm not sure I think that's answering the question that was asked. And when will that happen? It's so certificate dates, these kinds of certificate rules when they're done at CAB form level are always set at the day level. So you're never going to see anything that happens at 6 a.m. right? It will always be when the date rolls over. So it'll always occur at midnight. And that's just the level of granularity that the CAB form has agreed upon. So you'll never see anything more precise than the date level. And therefore it will be, basically what's the not before date, right? Whatever that date shows up on the certificate, that will be the date that it changes. So it will change as of the 15th. So on the 14th, you'll still have on the old rules. On the 15th, you'll have the new rules. Did I get all that? I know there were several questions clustered in there. Did I hit them all?
I think you got them all, yeah.
Okay, cool. And sorry again, I keep accidentally leaning on my keyboard just because I'm interested. That's what's going on. I'm shutting it off. So I'm moving my keyboard away from my hands. So please continue.
Yeah, so kind of circling back to the discovery question, there are a couple more that came in. So if every certificate contains client auth today, like how does doing an inventory tell me anything new if all of my public certificates include that client auth?
Yeah, I think as part of your inventory, you've got to try to figure out what you're doing with them. Right? So having a list of your certificates is part of it, but to understanding what are those certificates doing? What's their environment, what they're connected to, what's the use case is going to be important.
Yeah, TLS server certificates, you know what you're doing with them. They're in a web server somewhere, they're in a load balancer somewhere. For client authentication certificates, it could be anything. It could literally be anything. And that's problematic because those are the systems that are going to go down unless those things are addressed.
All right, great. One more question on discovery. Um, so if Sectigo is my public CA and we have a discovery tool to see unmanaged slash internal certs, how do we get the private CA status with Sectigo? I don't know if that's
Tim, I'm not sure I
Yeah,
quite get that one.
I'm trying to parse that question. I think the question is to say, can I use the SCM discovery tool? Well, let me ask you this question, Jason. We'll see if it's get it right.
Yeah.
Can we use the SCM discovery tool to find internal private CA certs that are in use in addition to the public CA certs that I have in use?
You can, but I think what should be noted is that we talk about the discovery capabilities within Sectico Certificate Manager. There is, I mean, we could do an entire webinar just on the richness of discovery, and we have other forms of discovery through our network agent, which is capable of doing full visibility to Microsoft CA certificates, as an example, as well as discovery of certificates inside of other vault systems, etc., etc. That could literally be an entire sales webinar on how that discovery works. So, short answer, yes, you could discover all sorts of private certificates within your organization using technologies that are available to you through SCM.
Thanks, Tim. I think you parsed that one correctly. Okay, so I know we're at time. There's one more question here that I'm going to
Okay,
ask if you guys have time, because I think
sure.
it's a pretty good one. So, for valid certificates that have client auth in June 2026, will the connection fail or generate a trust error if you're not using it for client auth? It's just,
Sorry, that's once again, that's issuance date. So if we didn't make that clear, I apologize. That's issuance date. So if you go and you get a cert that has a client auth EKU, anytime between now and June 14, or let's say between now and May 14, which is the day we're going to stop issuing them, that will live its full lifespan. So on May 14, you'll be able to get a 6-month cert. And that will last the full 6 months, even though we're beyond June. On March 14, you'll be able to get a 1-year cert, right? Before the maximum day drops down to 200 days. And that will live its full lifespan. So you could have certs with a client EKU sitting in the wild from Sectigo, or from another CA for that matter, as late as March 2026. Sorry, as late as March 2027, excuse me, as late as March 2027. And that's fine. That's perfectly legitimate. It's valid. It will work fine. It's compliant. Nobody is going to complain and nobody's going to revoke your cert. So the things that are already issued will be okay. We're talking about new issuance very specifically.
Tim, I think you're making the real good case for step 1 and 2 of taking inventory, because
Yeah.
if you know you have certificates that have active dates beyond, those are certificates you know that are on their final leg. The certificates you
Yes.
have to worry about are the ones that are going to expire, before that date, and you will not be able to get a replacement on the dates that are specified. So in other words, that September 15 date is when you will no longer be able to get new issuance, new replacement issuance from Sectigo for those client authentication certificates.
okay, perfect. Thanks.
Oh,
Um, so that was a great presentation, guys. Thanks for answering all the questions. We'll send out the recording after this to everybody who registered, and encourage you all to reach out to your Sectigo rep if you have more questions. They'd love to connect with you and answer those. So thanks everybody for attending.
thank you.
Thank you.